Alright, for this painting, you're going to need one piece of watercolor paper. We're going to need masking tape, the printout we're going to use for our tracing and as reference material, 2 or 3 brushes. I recommend a fairly good size round, a small round, and then a 1/2 inch flat brush. Such as 2 cups of water, some paper towel pieces, something to use as a palette. A paper plate or a foam plate works well. And then the paints we're going to be using are medium yellow, brilliant red, burnt umber, ivory black, and ultramarine blue. Now you of course can play with that. You can have any range of those colors that you want, but we are going to be mixing this color palette here. So the only reason we're going to be using black out of the tube is because it'll be simpler than trying to mix our own black, which is what I prefer to do. But we're going to warm it up and make it look more realistic by adding brown to that. So you'll need the black and the brown to make a very deep, rich color so that we can do the foreground and the cactus and make them look like silhouettes. And then basically you can use any combination of purple, red, blue, oranges, anything, yellows and stuff, whatever you've got, to either mix or use them straight out of the tube for the sky. It'll be totally up to you how you want to do your sky. It's going to be a wet on wet technique, and you can go a totally different direction than mine is. You can pick different colors, different patterns for your sky. You can choose to leave the sunspot or take it out. If you want to have a sunspot, you're going to preserve the white by painting around the sun so that paint doesn't go through, and we're just going to leave the white of the paper to make it shine through. In this demo I'm going to ignore the sun because especially for beginners it'll be easier to just paint through everything and not worry about that. So there'll be no sunspot on the one that I'm going to do for this demo. And then I've also been told by several people they don't like the look of this cactus, and I'm sorry about that. So apparently that's exactly what they look like. I traced it, okay? So I found that cactus in a photograph and traced it, but people don't like it. So you may change that cactus, okay? When we do the tracing here, feel free to make any changes you would like. Look up your own cactus, use these reference photos. They're in color in the document that I gave you. You could print them out, that would be useful, or just look at them on a screen. Or again, feel free to research and look up your own cactuses. Or cacti. Someone told me I think you can say either. Cacti, cactuses, I'm not sure. Anyway, have fun with that. If you don't need to trace, then just draw your own little scene. Okay, I am going to go through the tracing real quick to review how to do that. You are going to take the thing that you're tracing, and on the back we're going to scribble graphite. This doesn't have to be neat and pretty at all. Wherever there are lines that you are going to want to trace, you can kind of see them faintly through here. I'm going to do that. I'm going to mark the corners as well. Okay, I think that's good. Now, let's move the water out of the way. I'm going to lay the paper down, decide where I want to put this. Yes, it is going to be small. Okay, I do recommend that you paint small when beginning. There's a lot of different reasons for that, but you will be happier with your results when you're using smaller brushes especially. Watercolor dries so fast that when we're doing especially like wet on wet techniques, then it will be incredibly frustrating to try and cover a large area, and then while you're trying to work on this area is drying, and then you try to go back and rework it and it just gets all blotchy and doesn't have the effect that you were going for. Watercolor artists, it's very common for us to work in small little areas. You also will see people doing huge paintings, but they're usually a little more experienced, a little more skilled at that point. So when starting out, I like to go small. And in this way, if you don't like it, you can always do another one real quick. It won't take as long. And today with digital photography, these small things, we can take a picture of that, and then you can blow it up to whatever size you want and get it printed nicely. All right, so you've got options. Don't think that you have to paint really large when you're beginning. All right, so I'm going to transfer this by I'm going to mark the corners in here. So the graphite's going to press through to the other page. And I'm just going over all the lines that I want to keep. You can also change the shape of your mountains. Okay, and again, if you don't like that cactus, I'm sorry. You can change the look of it. It's bothering people for some reason. I think maybe it's because we're so used to thinking cactus look like this little guy all the time, when really they're pretty funky looking plants. But if our brains are used to thinking that they kind of always look like the cartoons we've seen, maybe I'll appease that, and here, we'll change the shape of the cactus. Okay, took out that arm. Just didn't trace it. We'll see if we like it better. No promises. All right, now when we lift that up, the reason you tape it down is so that you can lift it up and see, did you get all the areas that you want? Okay, I'm happy with that. Take that off, set it aside. Now, I want a nice, clean, sharp edge along my painting. So I'm going to tape off all 4 edges. And once we start painting now, I'm going to kind of speed through this quickly because you can always stop things and go back and restart the video and freeze it. Since this is not live, I'm going to go through it pretty fast. All right, so now that's going to keep the water from going off the edge. And now I'm also going to then tape this down to a board. Okay, blue is completely optional, actually. We just need it to mix purple. You can choose to put blue in your sky or not. So the one I did before, as an example, has blue in the sky. The 2 that I did in class yesterday, the only reason we used blue was just to make the mountain. Okay, and then there's 2 kind of versions that you can go for. One, I'll pull this up a little higher. Let me make sure the camera, yeah, seeing that well. This is a little bit more in the elementary direction, and we just kind of painted really thick and heavy for the cactus. This version is a little bit more advanced. We did paint around the sunspot to make it stand out, and that's just the natural white paper. And then we tried to make this area look a little bit more realistic as well. I painted just a little bit lighter. Okay, and that just gives a slightly more advanced look to your whole overall finished piece. Okay, so I've got my 2 cups of water here. I don't think you can see them as I pulled the camera down closer. I'll pull one closer so you can see. All right, the 3 brushes I'm using. Brush sizes are not standard, so it doesn't really matter that this says 8. That in another brand might be a 12. Okay, so you just want a medium size round, a smaller round, and then about a 1/2 inch flat. A little piece of paper towel. Extra scrap paper if you like to test your colors on. And then you're going to squirt out just a pea-size amount of those 5 colors. And we are ready to begin. Okay, before we actually start the painting, we're going to practice a little bit first. So we need to be able to do a flat wash. So I'm going to take my flat 1/2 inch brush here. I'm going to dip it in the water, and then I'm going to just choose one of these colors to practice with. I'll do the blue so it shows up well so you can see it. And I'm just going to make a puddle by taking about maybe half of that pea-size amount of paint. Going back to the water to get a few drips of clean water. And then when I'm happy with how that's mixed, I'm going to load my brush, which means I'm going to soak up a lot of pigment there. And I'm going to practice trying to get a flat wash. So I'm going to lift the board a little bit, which will create some gravity to create a little ribbon of paint. Okay, so see, it's going to pull right along there. I don't know what else to call that. It's a little puddle. I was calling it a ribbon. All right, so that's going to happen. And then I'm going to go back, load the brush again, overlap that stroke slightly, and just keep on doing that. The goal being to get a nice, flat, even look. And then that's not perfect, but you get the idea. Alright, we'll see how that looks when it dries. Keep in mind that when you're painting in watercolor, it will dry, I forget, it's like 40% lighter. It's sometimes pretty dramatic, and each color acts a little bit different. So you might be like, I like that color, and you come back in 10 minutes and like, what happened? It got so pale and muted. Okay, the video stopped recording. I had to fix that. I had to free up some space on the phone. I am back, but I didn't realize it wasn't recording while we did this part. So let me explain what happened here. We were practicing doing flat washes, and I wasn't real happy with how that turned out, so I did it again. Basically, you want to overlap the strokes with a loaded full brush, and then you'll be fine. Okay, here I was telling everybody to pause the video and just practice seeing what your brush can do and what kind of strokes it can make. We are looking for pigment loaded in the brush, a pigment to water ratio, and a loaded brush that will be able to produce these nice strokes where you're not going to lose the pigment for a while, rather than it being so pale like you can't even see that stroke that goes through there. We also don't want it to be so thick and heavy that you can't see through it and it creates these glossy streaks, or the paint is actually kind of sitting on top of the paper. The beauty of watercolor is that it is transparent, and we want to work with that nature. If you want to make something darker and you can't get it dark enough, you either need to mix the red with something else, try a different red. I'm using red because that's the example I used here, or build in layers. And so we were talking about glazing, where you lay one color on top of another once it's dry. So there's 3 techniques we're going to need to know how to use and practice here before we start the actual painting. One is the flat wash, right, where we're getting as even a look as we possibly can. 2 is glazing, where once something is dry, we lay a darker color on top. And then 3 is a wet on wet or wet in wet technique. I'm going to check and make sure this is recording still. Yes, okay. I'm all nervous because we had problems with the camera. All right. So wet on wet or wet in wet, you'll hear both said. To do the wet on wet technique, you're going to just get some clean water, load your brush with clean water, and you're going to paint the whole sky all the way down to the mountain range. Remember, this is just practice right now. With just water. And then I don't know if you can see that on the camera or not, but you should see water glistening when you turn your page at an angle, but it should not be soaking wet. It shouldn't be pooling or puddling anywhere. Okay, now I like a little more control over my sky, so I'm going to let that sit for just a minute where the water will soak in but not dry completely. And while I'm waiting for that, I am going to mix up a good purple. So I'm going to take about half of that red, the other half of the blue here. I'm going to add some water. And I'm going to play with that until I get a purple that I'm happy with. Okay. I like that. I might go a little bluer. There we go. That's the color I'm looking for. Okay, I like that for the mountain. I've got a lighter color here for the sky. Now I want to mix an orange for the sky as well. So you're going to start mostly with yellow and add just a little bit of red. It's hard to start with red and add yellow first. Always start with the lighter color and then go back. Okay. See, that's darker than I wanted it, so I'm going to go a bit lighter. Don't forget to add enough water that you create a whole pool. Puddle of color, at least a quarter size. All right, and I need to mix some just plain red. Okay, so I got all my colors prepped. Now, that took a little while. My sky might have dried too much, and it did. Okay, no worries. We can do that again. Ideally, we would have mixed the colors first and then painted the sky. Okay, no harm in this case. Alright, just gonna re-wet the sky. And shake it around, let it dry a tad. Okay, and this is just practice, so it doesn't really matter. Then I'm going to take a color I don't need, just because we're practicing. Okay. And then dropping in different colors here. I'm using brown just to show you, because I don't want to waste the colors I mixed. Okay, and you have fun. You can do little kind of dots and move them around a little bit. You can do streaks. You can change the direction of your streaks. Okay, and then you can lift the board and do this kind of thing and watch it run and bleed together. Okay, that is wet on wet. And that looks like a mess because I'm using crazy colors. But it will look a lot cooler when we do it for the sky. Okay, so 3 techniques: wet on wet, glazing, and flat wash. And that's all we need for this painting. Let's get going. Still recording? Yes. Okay, I'm so nervous now. All right, I'm going to turn this upside down and paint from the mountains down, because I personally just want everything to blend away from the mountains, and I just find it easier to work that way. You do not have to turn yours upside down. Taking the clean water, and yes, I'm going to paint through the cactus. Okay. Hopefully you drew it dark enough that you'll be able to see it after we add the paint. Okay. If you didn't, you might want to draw it in a little darker first before we start painting. Okay, so the whole sky is now just damp with water. And I'm gonna go load my brush with the yellow, and I'm gonna drop the yellow in right along the top edge of the mountains. Clean my brush. Take the extra water off of it with a paper towel or tapping on the side of the water cup. Then load your brush with a new color, and that will keep it much richer. You won't run out. It won't thin too fast. Okay, and then you get to choose whatever colors you want, how you want your sky to look. I'm going to do purple up here, and then pull that down to the red and get them to blend. Alright, and I think wet on wet techniques is the most fun thing to do. You can do some really cool stuff. You can also experiment and see what happens if you add really wet areas in. Okay, and you could just be done, hands off, leave it alone, or you could continue to fidget a little bit, up to you. Just don't overdo it. And then I'm gonna move this around, hold it up a little bit, so it will continue to bleed and blend together. Alright, our sky is done. I'm gonna let that just sit there. Now, we already mixed up the purple I need for the mountains. We are going to glaze the mountains right up to the edge and maybe overlap a little bit. That's what I'm calling a glaze. Okay, the purple will be darker than the sunset color, at least it is in my case. And so I can paint the purple slightly over top of the yellow and we'll be fine. In this case, I have a nice clean edge, so I'm going to try and paint right up to the edge. I just have to make sure that that part of the sky is dry before I start painting. Okay, and you can just test that sort of back of a clean finger, and if it still feels a little damp or cool to the touch, it is not dry. That feels dry enough, so I'm going to go for it. I'm going to clean my brush again. Make sure I've got enough of that purple, and I don't anymore because I used some for my sky. So I need to mix a little more purple. So where'd my blue go? There we go. Always squirt just a little bit of paint out first, because you can always go back and add more. But we can't put paint back in the tube, so we don't want to be wasteful. Okay, so I have scrap paper to test things. I am going for a dusty, cool purple, so that means it's going to lean on the blue end. we go. I like that. You could even go dustier by adding a tad, I'm talking a tad bit of black. Let's give it an even gray or dustier look. Okay, I like that. Now, I am going to, this is the flat wash. I can paint into the dark area where the brown's gonna cover, because we're gonna glaze the dark brown on top of the purple, so it doesn't matter. All I need to worry about is making sure that I get the mountain edge that I was going for. And ideally you want to do that in just as few strokes as you can. I'm going to go over it one more time. No, this purple, because the red I use, it stains. Okay. So once it's on there, it's on there. So you got to move quick. Now I didn't intend for it to do that fading there because my brush really wasn't quite wet enough to do a flat wash. So in this case, you're kind of seeing what a graded wash looks like, where it goes from darker to lighter. And especially for mountains, that can be a very cool effect because it could look a little misty off way out in the background, though it's a desert, so I guess it wouldn't really be misty. But it could just be kind of like, you know, the atmospheric haze. So I kind of like that. All right, we need to let that dry now. And that's going to take a few minutes. Okay. So if anytime you're waiting for something to dry before you can move on to the next stage, then continue to practice. Okay, work on your color mixing, practice some strokes, so we're ready for the next. While we're waiting for it to dry, this would be a good time to mix up our dark brown for the cactus. So I'm going to start with brown, and you can add a little bit of red to it if you want to warm it up even more. Totally up to you. And then we are going to mix black in as well because we need to get a rich, deep, dark brown. You're not going to add quite as much water to this puddle because we do need this to cover. We don't want to have a transparent cactus. So there's a fine line. It just takes some trial and error and lots of practice to get the amount of water to paint ratio correct so that this works, where you can cover an area but it not look so thick that like you're painting with like poster paints or acrylics. And so this is not ideal. So it's a little thin down here and a little dark up there. So I'm going to use my extra. See how much paint I had in that brush? It's too much. So I'm just going to get some of that paint off on this paper. And there. So there's a middle ground. So I'm not super thrilled with that. I think I need to add a little more black. So I'm not there yet. Okay, so I'm going to add a little bit more black. Okay, happier with that. All right, again, you can pause the video, practice. You want to be able to glaze, lay these dark colors over top of the light so that it still looks like watercolor, but you're not seeing the mountain and the sky through it. Okay, I think my sky is dry enough. I'm gonna make sure. Now, even with me taping it down, do you see how the paper is still warping a little bit? If it wasn't taped down, we'd be having real issues. All right, I got my dark brown ready to go. I'm not gonna use this big brush. I could, but it'll be frustrating for beginners because if you don't have a very light touch, then you're going to end up with big fat marks you didn't want. Okay, however, if you're more skilled, you could use a thicker brush and you just stay on the tiptoe and you can see what itty bitty little skinny lines I can get. Okay, so when you are more skilled with your brush, you can use the tip or make it as flat as you want, or even drag it along the side, okay, and create really broad strokes. So it's a very versatile thing to have. But we're going to go back to a smaller brush. We'll make life a little simpler. Okay, so loading that brush with the brown paint, and I'm going to go left to right since I'm right-handed. And I got to protect my hand. There's all that wet paint down there. And I'm just going to quickly paint in my cactus. So you should still be able to see the outlines coming through your transparent sky. And again, remember I said I was going to kind of speed through this, so if it's taking you a little longer, don't worry. Just pause it, finish your cactus, and then catch up with me. With using a smaller brush here, I am running out of the thicker paint very quickly, so that is a drawback. Smaller brushes cannot hold as much water. You've got to work quick, or else areas will start to dry before you have a chance to get things to merge and blend the way you want. Okay. Now I'm going to go with a little bit more realistic foreground look. So I'm going to use my small brush to create kind of these little sketchy marks here to kind of imply grasses, bumps, little rocks. Make that as smooth or as brushy and crazy looking as you like. This is a cheap brush, and so it doesn't create the little points real well. It's kind of frustrating. Work with what you got. I am painting with less expensive supplies so that you guys, because usually my beginner students, even my high school students and stuff, we're not using super expensive stuff, and so I like to paint with what you guys are working with so you can see what's possible. It's a little more frustrating, but this is realistic here. Okay, and I am just painting this in however which way I want. It doesn't have to be a flat wash or anything. It's okay if it looks a little rough. I actually am going to rinse my brush, dry it off with the paper towel over here. I don't think you can see, it's off camera. And I'm going to pull out the technique we haven't practiced, but I'm soaking up some of that extra paint. I'm just kind of scraping it off the paper basically. So I want to add some more texture and depth to this painting. So there. And then it's going to dry even a little lighter than that. So after that dries, I can do what's called a dry brush technique. So teaching all kinds of stuff I didn't plan on here. I'm going to mix even darker brown by starting with black and adding that to the brown I already mixed. Okay. And then I'm going to take a fully loaded brush and I'm going to kind of roll it on the paper towel over here. So what I did is I just did this kind of thing to get a lot of the extra water off, yet still keep the paint inside the brush. Doesn't always work, but looks like it's going to work in this case. And then we'll practice over here. Dry brush, I'm going to run the brush along the side, the edge here, and you see that nice kind of rough texture it's getting when I do that. So I'm going to try and do some of that on top of this to just give it a rocky, really messed up appearance. And the key to this is to have a lot of pigment but very little water. There you go. Okay, let's give it a try. Ooh, that's a crazy mess. I'll hide that again. It's not pretty. There you go. Remember, this is optional. Doing the dry brush thing, we didn't practice that. Okay, and that looks really dark there, but again, it's going to dry lighter than you're expecting. Blend that out down here, add a tiny bit more water, just blend that into the bottom. All right, and I'm gonna call that done. Now, if we were painting huge, it would have been more frustrating and we'd still be working on it. Okay, so go small. You can always paint larger later. Now, removing tape. You want to make sure that it's dry or nearly dry before you start pulling the tape off. If it's wet, then when you start to pull the tape, if it sticks at all, it's going to rip a big hole on the side of your picture. Pull the tape at an angle away from the painting, and that way if it does start to rip or stick, you can see it happening and stop before it does damage. Okay, it's going well. Okay, see how this is ripping here. Okay, if that were to happen, I wouldn't keep going. I'd want to try and stop and see if I could loosen that. Alrighty, there we go. And of course, after it dries, you should sign your work, take ownership. When something is painted like this dark and it would be hard to see a signature, then you could put your name down here on the white part, and then we just cut around and leave a nice white border. Alright, there we have it. We are done.